Some scars never heal. Others simply become invisible. This is the story of a soldier who came back from war carrying guilt, and of a father who lost something precious while waiting for him. It's about words left unsaid, time that slipped away, and the realization that true love doesn't need eyes to see. The Greyhound bus cut through the dusty Texas road as Ethan Mitchell watched Cedar Ridge emerge on the horizon through the dirty window. 4 years had passed since he left that small town 2 hours from Austin, heading out as a 22-year-old filled with purpose. Now he was returning at 26, carrying scars no one could see and nightmares that woke him every night at 3 in the morning. His hands trembled slightly as he held a crumpled letter, the last one he had received from his father 6 months earlier. Frank Mitchell had a firm and precise handwriting, a trait he carried from decades as a Vietnam War veteran who had found peace working with his hands. But this letter was different. The letters looked uncertain, a few words smudged, as if written with effort. "Son, I can't wait to see you back home. The garage just isn't the same without you here. I've been keeping that '72 Chevelle we found at the junkyard. I still believe we can get it to roar again when you come back." Ethan had read that letter hundreds of times, but only now on his way home did he notice the signs he had missed. His father never mentioned watching TV, stopped talking about weekend drives to Austin, and their phone calls had grown increasingly rare in recent months. The bus pulled into the small station, a refurbished trailer that served as the stop for the 3 lines that passed through town. Ethan stepped down slowly, adjusting the military backpack on his shoulders. The hot Texas air wrapped around him like a suffocating embrace, bringing back the familiar scent of barbecues and dry grass that once meant home. He walked along the familiar streets, noticing subtle changes. The hardware store was gone. A new Subway had taken the place of the old ice cream parlor, and several houses had "for sale" signs staked in their front yards. Cedar Ridge was aging, just like he was. The Mitchell house appeared at the corner of Maple Street, a pale blue wooden structure with a wide porch where Frank used to spend his afternoons restoring parts of classic cars. But today the porch was empty, no scattered tools, no sound of metal being sanded echoing through the air like it once did every afternoon. Ethan stopped at the sidewalk, just staring. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, and one of the shutters hung loose from its hinges. 4 years was a lifetime for a house, and for a man. He climbed the steps slowly, each one thudding like a drumbeat. Before he could knock, the door opened quietly, as if Frank had known the exact moment his son would arrive. There stood his father, thinner than Ethan remembered, wearing a red flannel shirt that looked far too big for his shrunken frame. His hair, once brown with streaks of gray, was now entirely white. But what cut into Ethan's heart like a blade were his father's eyes. The blue eyes that had always gleamed with fatherly pride and that unmistakable Texan grit were now dull, glazed over, staring blankly into space. Frank held onto the doorframe with one hand, the other reaching out hesitantly toward the sound of his son's steps. "Ethan?" Frank's voice was the same, but it carried a vulnerability that had never been there before. "Hey, Dad," Ethan managed to whisper, fighting the lump in his throat. Frank stretched out his trembling hands until they found his son's shoulders, his calloused palms mapping a face he could no longer see. His fingers traced Ethan's cheekbones, felt the beard he had grown, touched the small scars that combat had left behind. "My boy's home," Frank said, and his voice cracked on the last word. They embraced right there on the doorstep, 2 veterans from different generations. One who had fought in the jungles of Vietnam decades ago, and another who had just returned from the Rocky Mountains of Afghanistan, finally together again, yet separated by chasms neither one of them knew how to cross just yet. The inside of the Mitchell house was exactly as Ethan remembered, and completely different at the same time. The same furniture sat in the same places. The brown leather armchair where Frank used to watch football games, the oak dining table that had belonged to Ethan's grandmother, the framed photographs on the wall showing 3 generations of Mitchell men in military uniforms. But now, there was something new. Thin cords stretched along the walls, connecting the living room to the kitchen to the hallway, creating a tactile map Frank had built to navigate a world without light. "Sorry about the mess," Frank said, closing the door behind them. "Wasn't expecting company so soon." Ethan looked around. The house was spotless, every item in its exact place, as if Frank had memorized the location of every object with precision. It was impressive, and heartbreaking at the same time. Seeing how his father had adapted to a reality Ethan was only just beginning to grasp, hit harder than he expected. "When did you—" Ethan began, but the words caught in his throat. "When did I lose my sight?" Frank finished, moving with surprising confidence toward the kitchen. "Started 2 years ago, diabetes. Should have taken better care of myself after Vietnam, but you know how it is. We veterans think we're bulletproof." Frank laughed, but it was a joyless sound. Ethan followed him, watching how his father counted his steps, how his hands moved with certainty, knowing exactly where to find everything. On the fridge, photographs were held up by magnets, pictures of Ethan at his high school graduation, the day he enlisted, a few taken during brief leaves in his first year of service. "Coffee?" Frank asked, already reaching for the electric coffee maker with military precision. "Sure, Dad." While Frank prepared the coffee, Ethan noticed other details. The cans in the pantry had Braille labels. There was a small electronic device on the table that, when Frank pressed a button, announced the time in a robotic voice. His father had built an entire system to live independently, and it was both admirable and devastating. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Frank paused as he stirred the coffee, his shoulders stiffening. "And what would you have done? Dropped everything and come running back? You had a mission, son. Your unit needed you focused, whole, not with your head here, worried about a stubborn old man. You're not a stubborn old man. You're my father." "Exactly. And a father protects his son, even when the son is halfway around the world protecting strangers." They drank their coffee in silence, sitting at the table where they used to have breakfast before Ethan headed off to school. Frank held the mug carefully, his fingers mapping the rim to avoid spilling. Ethan watched every movement, trying to imagine how much time his father had spent relearning simple gestures like drinking coffee. "How did you know it was me at the door?" Ethan asked. Frank smiled for the first time since they'd reunited. "Your footsteps. You've always been heavy on the left foot from when you broke your ankle playing baseball, and you still tap your boot on the second step of the porch. You've done that since you were 15. It was incredible." Frank had memorized his son's sounds, stored away every detail like a treasure. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of guilt and admiration he didn't know how to deal with. "I should have come back sooner," Ethan said. "No," Frank answered firmly. "You did what you had to do, just like I did what I had to do here. I learned to live without seeing, Ethan. But I never learned how to live without waiting for you to come home." The weight of those words hung between them like smoke. Frank reached across the table until he found Ethan's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with his son's. It was a hesitant touch at first, then firm, like Frank was making sure Ethan was really there, that he'd finally made it back. "Now tell me," Frank said, "what was it like over there? And don't give me those sanitized stories you used to write in your letters. I want to know what my son really went through these past 4 years." Ethan looked down at their hands, his own, young but already worn from weapons and gear, and his father's, aged but still strong, still able to offer comfort. For the first time in 4 years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could talk about the things that kept him awake at night. But not yet. Not today. Today was just about being here, about rediscovering what it meant to be home, with a father who had learned how to see with his heart. The next morning, Ethan woke up in his childhood bedroom to the familiar sound of Frank moving pots and pans in the kitchen. For a moment, before fully opening his eyes, he allowed himself to pretend he was 16 again, and the last 4 years had just been one long nightmare. But the stiffness in his back, from sleeping on military bunks and tent floors, quickly pulled him back to reality. He followed the scent of bacon and fried eggs down the stairs. Frank was in the kitchen, moving with the same confidence as always. But now Ethan could see the little tricks. How his father slid his hand along the counter to orient himself. How he counted the drops of oil in the skillet by sound. How he tested the griddle's heat with the back of his hand held at a safe distance. "Morning, sleepyhead," Frank said without turning around. "Heard your steps on the stairs. Still stomping on that 5th step like it's about to break." Ethan chuckled. A real laugh, the first in months. Some habits never change, and thank God they don't. That's how I know my son's still in there, underneath all that soldier seriousness. They had breakfast together, Frank serving the plates with impressive precision. Ethan wanted to ask about doctors, treatments, whether there was any hope. But something in the way his father cut his bacon, so steady, so resolved, made him realize those conversations would have to wait. "How about we go for a drive today?" Frank suggested. "Haven't been out much lately. Mrs. Henderson always offers to take me to the market, but I'd rather stick close to home." "Sure. Where do you want to go?" Frank stayed quiet for a moment, chewing slowly. "Lake Travis. Haven't been there in 2 years. Before I lost my sight, I used to go every Friday morning. I'd sit on the pier and just watch the water. Now we can go together," Ethan finished for him. An hour later, they were in Frank's old Ford pickup, with Ethan behind the wheel, driving down the familiar back roads that led to the lake. Frank kept the window rolled down, letting the wind mess up his white hair, and Ethan noticed how his father tuned into every sound, the tires shifting from pavement to gravel, the distant hum of a tractor working the fields, the birdsong in the trees lining the road. "Pull over here," Frank said as they reached a particular bend. "You remember this place?" Ethan stopped the truck and looked around. It was a small clearing with a view of the lake, where an old oak tree offered generous shade. "The fishing tree," he said, the memory washing over him like a wave. "You were 8 the first time I brought you here. Told you I was going to teach you how to fish like a real man, not that pretend stuff in the creek behind the house." They climbed out of the truck and walked to the tree. Frank knew every root, every dip in the ground, guiding himself by memory and the sound of Ethan's footsteps. They sat in the grass, looking, or in Frank's case, listening, to the calm waters of the lake. "You cried that day," Frank said. "Not 'cause you were scared, but 'cause you hooked a fish that was too big and you had to throw it back. Said it wasn't fair to take the fish away from its family." Ethan remembered. He remembered the pull on the rod in his small hands, the thrill of something alive tugging back on the other end of the line, and the sudden decision that he didn't want to be the reason that creature got torn from its world. "Even at 8, your heart was too big for this world," Frank said, his voice as gentle as the breeze coming off the lake. "I always knew you'd make a good soldier, not for what you could destroy, but for what you'd choose to protect." They sat in silence, father and son, veterans of different wars, sharing a moment that needed no words. Frank reached out until he found a handful of pebbles and began tossing them into the water, using the sound of the splashes to gauge the distance. "Your turn," he said, offering a few stones to Ethan. Ethan took them and started skipping them across the water, trying to make them bounce just like Frank had taught him years ago. The first one sank straight down, the second skipped once, and the third made 3 perfect hops. "3 skips," Frank said, smiling. "You still got it. You taught me well. I tried to teach you everything I could before you grew up and didn't need the old man anymore. I'll always need you, Dad." Frank turned his face toward the sound of his son's voice, his clouded eyes searching for something they could no longer see. "I know, son, and I'll always be here, even when I'm not." The words hung in the air like promises or warnings. Ethan didn't fully understand what his father meant, but he tucked the phrase away in his heart, along with the peace he felt in that moment. Right there, in the place where he first learned that sometimes being strong means knowing when to let go. On Sunday morning, Frank woke Ethan earlier than usual. "Today we're going to the workshop," he announced, already dressed in a worn blue work shirt that had clearly seen better days. "There's something I want to show you." The workshop sat in the backyard, a wooden structure Frank had built with his own hands back in the 80s. Ethan hadn't stepped inside it since before he enlisted. It had always been his father's private sanctuary, a place where he'd vanish for hours, working on mysterious projects or just thinking, as he used to say. Frank led the way, counting steps to the door, his hand finding the lock on the first try. "Haven't been in here for almost a year," he admitted, turning the key. "But I saved something special for when you came back." The door creaked open with a familiar sound, and Ethan was instantly transported to his childhood. The smell of motor oil, old wood, and rusted metal filled his nose like a nostalgic embrace. Frank felt along the wall until he found the light switch, and when the bulbs flickered on, Ethan had to catch his breath. There it was, the 1972 cherry red Chevrolet Chevelle SS, just like Frank had promised in the letter. The car they'd found abandoned in a junkyard 3 years before Ethan enlisted. The one they'd bought for $300 with the promise they'd restore it together someday. "You kept it," Ethan whispered, walking around the vehicle. "Of course I kept it. A promise is a promise." Frank followed the sound of his son's voice, his hands landing on the hood of the car. "I worked on it for the first 2 years after you left. Got the engine running, replaced the brakes, welded the body where it needed fixing. But I had to stop when my vision started going." Ethan opened the hood and found a spotless V8 engine, every part cleaned and arranged with the same military precision Frank brought to everything in life. A handwritten list was taped to the underside of the hood, a detailed inventory of each part replaced, every repair made, with dates that stopped abruptly 2 years ago. "How did you do all this by yourself?" Ethan asked, genuinely impressed. Frank laughed, sitting down on a tall stool clearly placed there for this exact purpose. 40 years under the hood teaches you where every bolt is supposed to be. But once the diabetes started messing with my sight, I had to quit using the dangerous tools. Welding, grinders, power drills. It all got too risky. So what's left to do?" Frank turned his face toward the sound of Ethan's voice, his fingers running across the body of the car with a craftsman's touch. "Final prep for the paint job, the interior finishings, the little details that turn a car into a work of art. The parts I always said we'd do together." Ethan ran his hand over the car's surface and saw that it was in way better shape than he expected, though there was still work to be done. "You got everything ready so I could finish it." "Exactly. These last 2 years, even though I couldn't really work, I came out here every week. I cleaned parts, organized tools, mapped out every remaining step. I wanted to make sure that when you came back, we had a clear project ahead of us." Frank stood up and walked over to a workbench, his hands finding a leather folder. "It's all in here," he said, opening it to reveal dozens of sheets with notes, diagrams, and lists. "Every bolt that still needs tightening, every area that needs sanding, the exact order for painting. I wrote it all down while I could still see." Ethan flipped through the pages, floored by the level of detail. It was as if Frank had written an entire manual so they could keep working together, even with his blindness. "We can start today," Ethan said. "If you guide me." Frank smiled for the first time in days. "First, you need to feel the bodywork with your hands. I can teach you that. I learned how to find imperfections by touch after I lost my sight." For the next 2 hours, Frank guided Ethan through the process of inspecting the car's body. Even without his vision, he could identify problem areas by running his hands over the metal, teaching Ethan how to feel the subtle flaws that needed correcting. "Your granddad taught me to work with my hands when I came back from Vietnam," Frank said, while Ethan sanded a spot they'd found together. "Said a man who knows how to build something from scratch is never truly lost, no matter what war has done to his mind." Ethan stopped sanding. "Did the war mess with your mind too?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the workbench. "Everyone who goes to war comes back different, son. The question isn't whether you'll change. It's about choosing how you're gonna live with that change. And how did you deal with it? I built this workshop. I raised you. I found ways to turn hands that were trained to destroy into hands that know how to create." Frank turned toward Ethan, his clouded eyes full of a wisdom that went far beyond sight. "Now it's your turn to find your way." They worked until the sun began to set, Frank giving directions while Ethan sanded and prepped surfaces. It was therapeutic in a way Ethan couldn't explain. Each pass of the sanding block seemed to strip away a little of the tension he carried in his shoulders, each clean surface revealing not just raw metal, but the possibility of a new beginning. "Tomorrow we start prepping for the primer," Frank said, putting away the tools in the exact places he knew they belonged. "It's going to be a long job, but it'll be worth it. In the end, we'll have something beautiful we built together." Ethan's 3rd week at home settled into a quiet routine that both men embraced with relief. Mornings were spent in the workshop, working on the Chevelle, Frank guiding with words while Ethan handled each task. Afternoons found them on the porch, where Frank shared stories from Vietnam, while Ethan, for the first time, began talking about Afghanistan. And nights were for baseball games on the radio. Frank had developed an impressive ability to follow sports purely through sound. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while Ethan was prepping a section of the bodywork that Frank had identified by touch as uneven, that the phone rang inside the house. Frank lifted his head, listening to the ring, but made no move to answer. "You're not going to get that?" Ethan asked, pausing his sanding. "Probably Mrs. Henderson checking if I need anything from the store, or Dr. Martinez calling to set up another appointment that won't change a damn thing." Frank turned his face toward the rasping sound of the sander picking back up. "Today, I just want to work on this car with you." But the phone rang again an hour later, and again after dinner. On the third call, Frank let out a heavy sigh and got up to answer it, counting his steps toward the phone in the kitchen. Ethan couldn't help but overhear the conversation. "Dr. Martinez? Yes, I understand. No, I can't do Monday. Tuesday's fine. Yes, my son's here now. Thank you." Frank returned to the living room slower than usual, like he was carrying extra weight on his shoulders. "Routine checkup?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. Frank sat in his recliner, fingers tapping the armrest, a nervous habit Ethan remembered from childhood. Something like that. "Dad." "Ethan, tell me what's really going on." Frank was quiet for so long that Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was careful, measured. "The diabetes didn't just take my sight, son. There are other complications." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What kind of complications?" "Dr. Martinez wants to run some more tests, but—" Frank paused, rubbed his face. "My kidneys aren't working the way they should. My heart's struggling too. These are things that happen when you let diabetes run wild for too long. Why did you let it get out of control?" Frank let out a dry laugh. "After you left, taking care of myself didn't feel all that important. I ate whatever, skipped meds, stopped going to the doctor. Figured if something happened to me, at least it wouldn't be your problem." "Jesus, Dad. Don't start with that, Ethan. You were out serving the country, making a difference. I was just an old vet waiting on letters." Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing the room. The anger hit him fast and sharp, catching him off guard. "You're not just anything. You're my father. You're all I've got. And you're my son. That's why I wasn't going to burden you with the problems of a man who's already lived his life." They stood facing each other, Ethan staring at Frank, who turned his clouded eyes toward the sound of his son's voice, both breathing hard. It was the first real fight they'd had since Ethan came home, and the air between them was thick with 4 years of unsaid things. "How long?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now. "What? How long do you have?" Frank sighed. "Doctors say months. 6, maybe. A year if I do everything right. But you know how doctors are. Always the worst-case scenario." Ethan dropped heavily onto the couch, head in his hands. "Why didn't you tell me when I got back?" "Because you just came home from a war, carrying your own demons. Because I wanted us to have time to be father and son again, before we became patient and caregiver. And now you know. And now we can choose how to spend the time we've got." Ethan looked up at the man who raised him, who taught him how to fish, drive, shoot, who waited 4 long years while his own body quietly broke down. Frank Mitchell, Vietnam veteran, who survived a war only to be worn down by a quiet disease. "We're finishing the car," Ethan said. "What?" "The Chevelle. We're finishing it. Together. No matter how long it takes." Frank smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was completely genuine. "It's going to be a lot of work. Just the prep for paint will take weeks, and I can only guide you. Then we better start early. You know every inch of that car, even without seeing. I'll be your eyes and your hands." "Ethan?" "Yeah? Thanks for coming home. Thanks for waiting." That night, Ethan stayed up late, listening to the uneven rhythm of his father's breathing in the room next door, mentally calculating time and possibilities. 6 months, maybe a year. It wasn't enough to make up for 4 lost years, but maybe it was enough to build something new, something that honored both the time they'd lost and the time they still had. For the first time since coming back from war, Ethan had a clear purpose: to make every day count. The weeks that followed unfolded like a delicate dance between progress and decline. As the Chevelle slowly came back to life under Ethan's hands, guided by Frank's seasoned voice, the older veteran's health was quietly slipping. Ethan learned to recognize the signs: the heavier breathing after climbing the stairs, the longer pauses during their walks to the workshop, the subtle way Frank would steady himself against the edge of the workbench, when he thought no one was watching. Dr. Martinez came to the house on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October. Ethan was in the workshop, applying a second coat of primer, when he overheard the conversation through the open window. The doctor, a kind man of Mexican descent who had been caring for Frank for over a decade, spoke in soft, measured tones. "Frank, the results aren't what we hoped for. Your kidneys are operating at only 30%, and the heart, well, we can't ignore the symptoms much longer." "How long, doctor?" Frank's voice was steady, military. "If we start dialysis immediately, maybe 6 months. Without it, 6 weeks, possibly 2 months." The spray gun slipped from Ethan's hands. 6 weeks. The words echoed in his head like distant artillery fire. All his military training had taught him how to assess risk, to plan for contingencies, but nothing prepared him for the brutal arithmetic of mortality. "And what would dialysis mean exactly?" Frank asked. 3 times a week in the hospital, 4 hours per session. You'd feel weak, nauseous most of the time. "It's not living, Frank, it's just more time." Ethan leaned against the workshop wall, eyes closed. He already knew what his father's decision would be before the words came out. "Doctor, I survived Vietnam, raised a son on my own, and learned to live without sight. I'm not spending my last months hooked up to a machine, waiting to die in a hospital bed. Frank, my decision's made. How long do I have to put my affairs in order?" "I'd say 6 weeks, maybe 8 if you take care of yourself." After Dr. Martinez left, Ethan stayed in the workshop for over an hour, watching raindrops slide down the dusty window pane. 6 weeks, 42 days, 1,080 hours. Each number felt smaller than the last, like time itself was folding in on them. Frank appeared in the doorway, moving slower than usual, but still carrying that quiet dignity that had always defined him. "You heard?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard." Frank walked over to the Chevelle, his hands finding the freshly painted hood. "It's looking good. Your work's flawless. Dad, Ethan, look at me." Frank turned his face toward his son's voice. "I don't want you spending what time we have left trying to change my mind or drowning in grief. I made this decision as a free man, and I want you to respect that." Ethan swallowed the knot in his throat. "What do you want to do?" "I want to finish this car with you. I want you to tell me about the war, what really happened, not the watered-down stuff. I want to sit on the porch in the afternoons, listen to baseball games, and talk about your mother. And I want to teach you a few things before I go." "What kind of things?" Frank smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "How to live with scars from war, how to turn pain into purpose, how to be a good man even when the world doesn't make sense." They worked on the car until the sun went down, Frank giving precise instructions while Ethan applied paint with careful, almost reverent strokes. The work became meditative, almost sacred. Every brushstroke felt like a silent prayer, every finished section a small victory against the ticking clock. "You know your mom died in this car?" Frank said suddenly, breaking hours of concentrated silence. Ethan froze. "What?" "Not literally, but she was driving this Chevelle on the way to the hospital when she had the accident. 8 months pregnant, heading to another routine checkup." Frank ran his hand along the body of the car with reverence. "I always thought it was cursed. Bad luck. That's why I let it rot in that junkyard all those years." "What made you change your mind?" "Because I realized I was looking at it all wrong. This car didn't kill your mother. It was taking her to care for you. It was love in motion, not tragedy." Frank turned his face toward Ethan. "Sometimes you've got to restore broken things to understand that not everything painful needs to be thrown away." That night, Ethan dreamed of his mother for the first time in years. In the dream, she was driving the red Chevelle down an endless road, waving at him through the rearview mirror. And when he woke up, there were tears on his face and a strange peace in his chest. 6 weeks. They would make each day count like a lifetime. November arrived in Cedar Ridge with an unexpected chill that made Frank wear 2 jackets just to get to the workshop. His hands shook more now, not just from the cold, but from a weakness that grew day by day. Ethan noticed how his father leaned more heavily on the workbenches, how his instructions came slower now, broken up by deep breaths that seemed to take deliberate effort. The Chevelle was nearly finished. The cherry-red paint gleamed under the workshop lights like a polished gem, and Ethan had spent days working on the interior's final details. Frank insisted on touching every surface, feeling the texture of the freshly installed upholstery, the smoothness of the seams, the precision of the fittings. "It's perfect," Frank said on a Thursday morning, his trembling hands gliding over the restored steering wheel. "Better than I ever dreamed when we first bought this beauty. All that's left is one last coat of clear and a few engine tweaks," Ethan replied, watching as his father gripped the car door for balance. "I don't think I'll see it finished," Frank said with a simplicity that cut through Ethan's heart. "Don't say that, Dad." "Ethan." Frank turned his face toward the sound of his son's voice, his clouded eyes reflecting the overhead lights. "I may not see, but I can feel my body giving out. Every morning's harder than the one before. We need to talk about a few things." They walked back to the house slowly, Frank stopping twice to catch his breath. They sat in the kitchen, where a warm cup of coffee helped thaw the old veteran's frozen hands. "There's a few things in my office you'll need to know about," Frank began. "Documents, insurance papers, that kind of stuff. But there's also a shoebox in the bottom drawer of my desk. When I die, and it won't be long, I want you to wait at least a week before you open it." "What kind of box?" Frank smiled with a quiet mystery Ethan couldn't quite decipher. "Letters, a lot of letters. I wrote one to you every month while you were away. Sometimes more than one on days I missed you more than usual." Ethan's heart skipped. "Why didn't you send them?" "Because they were letters from a father missing his son, not from one soldier to another. I wrote about the diabetes getting worse, about how afraid I was to be alone, about watching the sunset for the last time before losing my sight. Those were things you didn't need to carry with the rest of the war." Tears stung Ethan's eyes. "I wish I'd carried them, Dad. I wish I'd been here." "I know, son, and that's why I wrote them, so that one day when you were ready, you'd know exactly how those years felt on this end." In the days that followed, Frank grew weaker. Ethan took over every household chore, cooking simple meals Frank could barely finish, helping him up the stairs that seemed to grow steeper with each passing night. Still, the veteran insisted on going to the workshop every morning, even if just to sit on the stool and listen to Ethan work. "Tell me about Kandahar," Frank asked one Friday afternoon, while Ethan applied the final coat of clear to the hood. For the first time, Ethan spoke about the war with no filters. He told him about the suffocating heat of the Afghan mountains, about Private Jenkins dying in his arms after stepping on a mine, about the sleepless nights when mortar fire blended with nightmares of home. Frank listened in silence, sometimes nodding, sometimes just breathing deeply. "You did what you had to do," Frank said when Ethan finished, "and now you're learning how to live with it. That's what real men do." On Sunday, Frank didn't get out of bed until nearly noon. When he finally made it down to the kitchen, he looked visibly weaker, his skin taking on that gray pallor Ethan recognized from the final days of wounded soldiers. "I think it's time to call Mrs. Henderson," Frank said, slumping into a chair. "And maybe Pastor Williams. There are a few things I need to set right." "How long do you think?" "Days. Maybe a week." Frank reached for Ethan's hand and found it. "Don't be afraid, son. I'm not. I lived a good life, raised a good man, and I'll go, knowing you've got the strength to face whatever comes." That night, Ethan sat out on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the clear Texas sky. Frank had gone to bed early, exhausted by the simple effort of being alive. The Chevelle sat finished in the workshop, gleaming like a fulfilled promise. But Ethan knew his father would never drive those roads again. Autumn was ending, taking with it the last of the leaves and the last days of Frank Mitchell. But there was something beautiful in the farewell, a quiet completeness, like a circle finally closing. Ethan held the Chevelle's key in his pocket and made a silent promise. When it was all over, he would drive that car to every place they had once dreamed of going, together. Frank Mitchell died early Tuesday morning, as November gave way to December and the first frost blanketed the fields surrounding Cedar Ridge. Ethan had been sleeping in the armchair next to his father's bed, where he'd spent the last 3 nights, when the silence woke him. It wasn't a sound that stirred him, but the absence of one. The labored breathing that had become the soundtrack of their days had finally ceased. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains as Ethan realized Frank was too still, too peaceful. His hands, which had trembled so violently in recent days, now rested calmly on his chest, and his face wore the most serene expression Ethan had seen in weeks. "Dad?" Ethan whispered. though he already knew there would be no answer. He sat on the edge of the bed and held Frank's hand, still warm, but without the strength that had always defined it. For a moment that felt eternal. Ethan just sat there, memorizing every line on the face of the man who had raised him, every scar on the hands that had taught him how to fix engines and fish on the lake. "Thank you for waiting for me to come home," Ethan said into the quiet. "Thank you for showing me how to be a real man." The hours that followed passed in a fog of phone calls and procedures. Dr. Martinez came and confirmed what Ethan already knew. Mrs. Henderson wept on the porch like she'd lost a brother. Pastor Williams spoke of eternal peace and hands that had built more than they ever destroyed. The funeral director, a kind man named Thompson, treated Frank with the reverence owed to a veteran. But it wasn't until late in the afternoon, after everyone had left and the house had gone quiet again, that Ethan remembered the shoebox. He walked to Frank's office with heavy steps, each one echoing through the empty house. The room still smelled like his father: Old Spice, motor oil, and coffee. The oak desk was as orderly as ever, every paper exactly where it belonged. The bottom drawer resisted slightly before sliding open, as if reluctant to give up its secrets. There it was, a plain shoebox, tied shut with a faded red string. On the lid, in Frank's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Ethan, when you're ready to hear what I never got to say." Ethan held the box to his chest and felt its weight, not just physical, but emotional. It was like cradling 4 years of longing, of love unspoken, of words that had waited patiently for their moment to be heard. He carried it to the living room and sat in Frank's armchair, the same one where he'd seen his father read the paper and listen to baseball games. With trembling hands, he untied the string and lifted the lid. Dozens of envelopes lay inside, arranged by date, each one addressed to "My son Ethan" in handwriting that began firm and grew gradually shakier as Frank's vision declined. There were letters of all sizes, some only a single page, others filled with multiple sheets, packed with his tight veteran script. Ethan picked up the first letter, dated 1 week after his deployment to Afghanistan. "My dear son, it's been 1 week since you left, and the house still echoes with your absence. I tried watching the Cowboys game yesterday, but it just wasn't the same without you yelling at the coach. I know I can't send this. You need to stay focused on the mission. But writing to you helps me feel like we're still talking." Ethan's voice caught in his throat. He could hear Frank's voice in every word, could picture him sitting at that very desk, writing in the stillness of Texas nights. He pulled out another letter from the middle of the stack. "Ethan, today, doctor. Martinez confirmed I'm going blind. I spent the whole day crying, not from self-pity, but because I'll never see your face when you come home. But then I remembered the first time you rode a bike by yourself. I let go, and you pedaled away, and even though you couldn't see me anymore, you knew I was there, cheering you on. That's how I feel now. Even if I can't see you, I know you're okay. And that's enough." Tears rolled down Ethan's face as he read letter after letter. Frank had documented everything: the small victories, fixing the kitchen faucet while blind, the moments of despair, sleepless nights wondering if Ethan was safe, the treasured memories, teaching him how to drive, and the dreams for the future, working together on the Chevelle. The final letter was dated just 1 week earlier. "My son, if you're reading this, it means I've finally gone. I hope it's not too hard on you. I want you to know that every day I lived after you came home was a gift. Watching you heal, working on the car with you, hearing you talk about the war, all of that brought me a peace I hadn't felt in years. The Chevelle is nearly finished. Finish it, son. Drive it. But don't drive to escape your scars. Drive to find your purpose. There are other veterans out there who need someone who understands, someone who knows the weight of carrying war in their bones. I love you more than I ever managed to say. You are my greatest pride, my masterpiece. Now go be the light in someone else's darkness, the way you were always mine, always your father, Frank." Ethan held the letter to his chest and finally let the tears come, tears not of despair, but of deep, soul-wringing gratitude. Frank had found a way to be present even in his absence, to offer love even in death. Outside, the Chevelle waited in the workshop, red as a promise kept. And somewhere out there, other veterans waited too. Men and women who needed someone who understood that some battles go on long after the guns fall silent. 3 weeks had passed since Frank's funeral, and Ethan had read every letter at least twice. Some he knew by heart, especially the ones where his father recalled childhood memories Ethan thought only he had remembered. The Mitchell house was too quiet now, every room echoing with the absence of a presence that had been constant for 26 years. The first few days after the burial were a haze of grief and gratitude. The letters had changed something deep inside him, like Frank had managed to perform a posthumous surgery on his son's heart, removing years of guilt and replacing them with purpose. But something was still missing, an action that would turn all that emotional revelation into forward motion. One December morning, while drinking coffee in the empty kitchen, Ethan saw a notice in the local newspaper. San Antonio Veterans Rehabilitation Center seeks volunteers for support program for visually impaired veterans. He cut it out and placed it beside Frank's final letter. His father's words echoed in his mind. There are other veterans out there who need someone who understands. That afternoon, Ethan stepped into the workshop for the first time since his father's death. The Chevelle waited for him, almost finished, needing only the final touches Frank hadn't lived to see. Ethan started the engine. The V8 purred like a dream, each cylinder firing in harmony like a mechanical symphony. He spent the rest of the day completing the final details, tuning the carburetor using the exact notes Frank had left behind, installing the last chrome emblem, polishing every inch of paint until it gleamed like a red mirror. By the time he finished, the sun was setting behind the backyard oaks. Ethan sat in the driver's seat for the first time, his hands resting on the wheel Frank had touched so many times in recent weeks. The cabin smelled of new leather and fresh oil, a scent of promises fulfilled. "It's ready, Dad," he said into the stillness of the workshop. The next day, Ethan drove the Chevelle down the familiar roads of Cedar Ridge. The car responded like a dream, every curve taken with the ease that only vehicles built with love ever achieve. He stopped at Lake Travis, where he and Frank had fished so many times, and sat quietly, watching the calm water reflect the cold December sky. It was there that he made his decision. That same afternoon, Ethan called the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. The woman who answered, Sarah Chen, was a former military nurse who had lost part of her vision in a mortar attack in Iraq. "We're looking for volunteers who've seen combat and understand the unique challenges of blind veterans," she explained. "It's not just about Braille or walking with a cane. It's about helping these men and women rediscover who they are beyond their disability." "I understand," Ethan said, thinking of how Frank had navigated the world without sight but never lost who he was. "When can I start?" A week later, Ethan drove the Chevelle to San Antonio for the first time. The car sliced through the highway like a red arrow, and Ethan caught himself smiling, something that had felt foreign for months. Frank would have been proud of how the project turned out, but prouder still of the path his son was about to walk. The center was a modern building surrounded by well-kept gardens. Sarah met him at the entrance, a woman in her early 40s, Asian, with a faint scar on her left temple and eyes that seemed to see more than most people with perfect vision. "You must be Ethan," she said, offering her hand. "Welcome to the team." She showed him around the facility, mobility training rooms, a specially designed kitchen where veterans learned to cook independently, and a workshop where they used tools adapted for the visually impaired. "War teaches us how to fight," Sarah said as they walked. "But no one teaches us how to live afterward, especially when parts of us no longer work the way they used to." In the rec room, Ethan met Marcus, a former Marine sergeant who'd lost his sight to an IED, and Tommy, an Army vet blinded by shrapnel wounds. They were playing adapted dominoes, the pieces marked with raised dots. "New recruit?" Marcus asked when Sarah introduced him. "Afghanistan. 4 years," Ethan replied. "Welcome to the Broken Club," Tommy said with a laugh, not bitter, just honest. "Sarah'll teach you how to teach. It's harder than it sounds." Ethan spent the next few hours observing Sarah work with different veterans. She didn't treat them like victims or patients, but like soldiers mastering new tactics for a different kind of battle. There was dignity in the process, purpose in the routine, and hope in every small daily victory. When it was time to leave, Sarah walked Ethan out to the parking lot. "Beautiful car," she said, admiring the Chevelle. "Looks like it's got a story." It does. A story about a father and a son, and how sometimes you have to finish what someone else started. Sarah nodded, like she understood completely. That's why you're here, isn't it? To finish something someone started in you. Ethan smiled, jangling the keys in his hand. I think so. Driving back to Cedar Ridge, with the Chevelle's engine singing on the open road, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, that he was in the right place, doing the right thing, honoring both the dead and the living. Frank had planted a seed with those unsent letters. Now, it was Ethan's turn to help it grow. Bloco 10. O circolo completo. 6 months had passed since Ethan began working at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. What had started as 2 afternoons a week quickly turned into an almost daily presence. Sarah Chen had become more than just a supervisor. She was a friend who understood the quiet language of wounded veterans, who knew when to offer help and when to let them fight their own battles. On a hot afternoon in June, Ethan was in the center's workshop teaching Marcus how to use an adapted drill when he received a phone call that would change everything. On the other end of the line, a young and hesitant voice introduced himself as David Torres, a 24-year-old soldier who had lost his sight in an explosion in Iraq 3 months earlier. I heard about your program, David said, his voice heavy with a familiar weight of hopelessness. I don't know if this can help me, but I can't leave the house anymore. My parents are desperate, and I just want to feel like I still matter. Ethan closed his eyes, hearing echoes of his own voice from 6 months earlier when he had first arrived in Cedar Ridge. David, where are you? Austin. I live with my parents since I got back. I'll come get you tomorrow. There's something I want to show you. The next morning, Ethan drove the Chevelle down familiar roads to Austin. The car had become more than a means of transportation. It was a moving bridge between his past and his future, carrying Frank's presence in every curve of the Texas highways. David Torres was waiting on the porch of a modest house in the Austin suburbs. He was a young Hispanic man, far too thin, with a scar across his forehead and eyes that bore the same cloudy glaze Ethan had seen in his father. His parents, Maria and Carlos, stood at the door, watching with that unique blend of hope and protectiveness that only parents of wounded veterans truly understand. Are you Ethan? David asked, as he heard the footsteps approach. That's me, and that's the sound of a '72 Chevelle cooling down. My dad and I restored it together. David smiled for the first time in months. I used to help my uncle in his garage before the war. Always loved working on cars. Perfect, because I'm going to teach you how to do that again. On the drive to the center, Ethan told David about Frank, about the unsent letters, about how he had learned that real strength wasn't in hiding the scars, but in finding purpose through them. David listened in silence, occasionally nodding, sometimes wiping away tears he couldn't hold back. My dad's a veteran too, David said when they arrived at the center. Vietnam. He doesn't talk much about it, but since I got back, we've talked more. War connects us in strange ways, Ethan replied, thinking of Frank, even when we don't want to admit it. In the months that followed, David became one of the center's greatest success stories. Ethan taught him how to use adapted tools, how to navigate the workshop using tactile and auditory cues, how to rediscover the joy of creating something with his own hands. More importantly, David learned that blindness hadn't taken away his identity. It had simply transformed it. You changed my life, David said one afternoon in September, as they worked on a woodworking project. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Ethan replied. You need to pay it forward. One day, you'll meet another veteran who needs to hear that life goes on after war, that scars can become bridges for others. That night, Ethan drove back to Cedar Ridge with a fullness in his heart he hadn't felt in years. The Mitchell house no longer felt empty. It was filled with purpose, with honored memories, with a future Frank would have approved of. He stopped by the workshop and sat inside the Chevelle, watching the sunset through the dusty window. In his pocket, he carried a letter he had written to Frank that morning. Not to send it, of course, but to continue the conversation that Frank's letters had begun. Dad, Ethan said into the silence of the workshop, I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. It's not about winning the war. It's about choosing what to do with the soldier who comes back from it. 3 years had passed since that first day at the center. Ethan now coordinated a program that had helped more than 50 veterans rebuild their lives. David Torres had become his assistant and closest friend. The Chevelle still roared across Texas roads, carrying Ethan to speaking events at other centers, to the homes of veterans who needed to hear they weren't alone. And sometimes, when he drove down empty roads at dusk, Ethan could feel Frank in the passenger seat, not as a ghost, but as the quiet certainty that some bonds outlive time, that true love finds ways to endure across generations. The circle had closed. The son had become the father, the soldier had become the healer, and the scars of war had become bridges of hope for others still searching for a way home. Frank Mitchell would have been proud. If you've made it this far, this story touched your heart just like it touched ours. Stories like this remind us that true love transcends time, and that our scars can become bridges for others. Like this video if it moved you, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to receive more stories that stir your soul. Comment below, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Share this story with someone who needs a message of hope and healing. Thank you for watching, and for being part of our community. Until the next story.